If you take your Bible and go to the Gospel of Mark, as we continue to look at this book a week, and we're just starting into the New Testament, and the look at the Gospels, this week Mark, and then next week Luke, and then Acts, and as we move forward into a missions conference. The Gospel of Mark. When we dealt with Matthew, we said that for many, many years, for a long time, it was felt and believed that the Gospel of Mark, if I say it was the priority gospel, that is that it was the first gospel and that the other writers borrowed from Mark. That has been a dominant position for such a long time that it's actually a shifting position. We're not sure that Mark was indeed the first of the gospel writers. It is possible, as we talked about Matthew, that Matthew may have actually preceded Mark. But each of the Gospels is presenting what we believe is the good news about who Jesus is, and trying to present from an eyewitness approach the identification of Jesus the Christ. And so we need to deal with some of those introductory things regarding Mark and the Gospel first. One of the first ones that we might ask, obviously, was, well, who was Mark? Mark was not an apostle. Mark, many believe, in tradition, not just merely because of words, but because of writings in the early church fathers, do tell us that Mark probably was the same Mark of Acts fame. Remember that on the first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas took John Mark with them, and then he left them, departed, and returned home. And that caused a bit of a stir between Paul and Barnabas, that prior to the second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark with him, and Paul said no, caused somewhat of a debate between them. It ended up being divided into two mission teams. Paul took Silas, Barnabas took Mark. But we do know there must have been some measure of reconciliation between Paul and Mark, because by the time we get to the end of Paul's life, his last letter, he says to bring Mark with you because he's profitable for me. And so there must have been something that changed in Mark, and certainly something that changed in the relationship between Mark and Paul. The other thing that seems to be true of Mark is that he was a very close associate, some think maybe even a relative, of Peter. And what that leads to is the conclusion that what you have in the Gospel of Mark is essentially would be Peter's gospel. That Mark is either a relative or a very close associate with Peter. So that what you have in Mark's gospel is Peter's account. Peter, we know from his writings of his letter, 1st and 2nd Peter, if you were to take this, you might be able to lay this right alongside, and I think for good reason, to lay it alongside the letters that Matthew is preaching through, and when he's preaching through 1 Peter, you can take Mark and look at the two, read the two together. One might be Peter's gospel, the other is Peter's letter. And certainly, as an associate of Peter, that's why they would give it apostolic authority. And so we see Jesus presented here probably through the lens of Peter's influence in teaching and instruction and the things he shared with Mark. If you want to place it in time, we place it in time probably about 65 AD. And what that means is this, that this was probably written and circulated after Peter's martyrdom. And so it may be Peter's account through Mark's writing, but Peter has already died. And to place Peter's death in a context, we need to understand what was going on in the context of time when Mark wrote this and to whom he wrote it. Mark wrote this to Christians in Rome. The emperor at the time would have been Nero. Now, Nero's infamous for a number of things. One of those we'll highlight in a moment. But Nero came to the throne of the emperor to be emperor of Rome, probably through some manipulation of his mother, through some political intrigue. And when Nero began, he really was in good stead with the Senate and seemed to have a temperament about him that would be favorable towards the people. But over time, what became very evident is that Nero was an egotistical despot. That Nero was more focused and interested in his own agenda and his own personal self-serving than he was really in the interests of the people. And he manifested that in a number of ways. So you'll often hear about some of the exploits of Nero that have to do with his wanting to be on stage, singing, acting, playing instruments. Everything was to call attention to himself. And so everything that he did was to enlarge his own ego. And over the course of time, that led to how he treated others, to the point that his relationship with the Senate deteriorated, where the Senate really was looking to how do we deal with this man. Now, he may have had some other physical and also some other disorders, emotional and mental disorders, but he became a tyrant, only interested in himself. And of course, the way in which we look at that historically, that people often associate with this, was in 64 AD, Rome was on fire. And that's where the phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. We don't know if he fiddled while Rome burned, but the idea was that Nero was more centered on himself and was willing to have the poor parts of Rome destroyed by fire in order to bring more attention to himself. He was able, out of that, to build some magnificent buildings as a result of that, in places where there had been homes or buildings that were run down. And so it's his urban economic development plan, if you want to say. Now, we're not sure, but there are indications and certainly suspicions that Nero had Rome torched by his command, that he's the one who was responsible for the fire ultimately. But you can't take that, and so he needed a scapegoat when the shadow of suspicion began to point to him, and so he looked to others that he might indeed blame. And the most natural group in Rome to blame were Christians. He despised them. He despised what they stood for, represented. He despised their king. And so Christians were left then to be rounded up and dealt with even by persecution. And so that began this period of persecution, intense persecution, that these Christians in Rome were experiencing. Horrible things. Nero himself would go to the circus to either watch or in some fashion participate in the execution of Christians. Stories of Christians being wrapped in the skins of animals and thrown to wild dogs to be eaten alive by dogs, or used as human torches to light Nero's garden. Understand that these are the people that Mark is writing to. These are the people that Peter wrote to in 1 Peter. The people who are undergoing tremendous suffering and persecution at the hands of one who is self-centered, egotistical, and used his power to only benefit himself. When you open to Mark chapter 1, it just has some summary ideas, and then we're going to look at one particular text. Mark chapter 1 begins with a very simple statement by Mark. He says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The beginning. That's very important and instructive, because you'd think that Christianity is on the way out. It's going to be stamped out with the persecution that's being rained down upon it. And yet he looks at this and says, this is the beginning. This is a message of hope. This is something to say, listen, remember the words of Jesus that said the gates of hell won't even prevail against this. See? The beginning of the gospel here is not what we have in front of us in Mark's writing. Do not understand that when it says the beginning of the gospel, that he's referring to the written word that is called the Gospel of Mark. What he's saying is it's the beginning of the good news. The beginning. This is as the good news of Christ is going forth. It's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to advance this good news. And then there are two confessions that are tied to this opening statement. Two confessions that are contained in Mark's gospel. And so it is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, who is the Christ. In Mark chapter 8, Mark records this, and it's a very similar recording that you'll see in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus is with his disciples, and he says to them, "Who do men say that I am?" And of course, Peter's response, the great confession of Peter, is, "Thou art the Christ. You are the King. You are the Messiah. You are the one for which we have longed and hoped for. You are the one that God has appointed to this role." Certainly Jewish in context. You're the Christ. Peter died for that confession. Okay? Remember, Peter's already died. Peter has been willing to give his life for that confession about who Jesus is. And so now, this is very important as Mark recounts that to people who are dying for their confession that Jesus is the Christ. The second is the Son of God. The Son of God was not a foreign term to Rome. Nero, as some of his predecessors had done before him, had taken the title, the Son of God, and used that to refer to himself. That is a part of the cult worship, the cult expression of who the emperor was, that he's in some measure divine. This term, the Son of God, was applied to Nero himself. And now, at the beginning of this gospel, Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of God. And the second confession is in Mark chapter 15. In Mark chapter 15, while Jesus is on the cross, and at the great events that transpire at the cross, it is a Roman centurion at the foot of the cross who looks and says, "Behold, truly this man is the Son of God." And now you have the testimony not only of Jewish Peter, you have the testimony and confession of a Roman soldier. This man, not Nero, this man, Jesus, King of the Jews, is indeed the King of all. two tremendous confessions that are there contained in Mark's gospel, and he references that very, very early on, again, to people who are suffering and dying for believing and confessing that Jesus is the Christ and Jesus is the Son of God. And then on the heels of that, there is the quotation as he begins with the quotation from the prophet Isaiah, which I think becomes instructive later on when we're in Mark chapter 10. One of the other things that seems to characterize Mark's gospel is that it seems to carry with it a mission. It is missional in that Jesus is on a mission. And Mark seems to bring that out in a number of ways. In very clear statements, again, one we'll look at in just a little bit. But for example, in chapter 2, in response to him eating with sinners, in verse 17, "In hearing this, Jesus said to them, 'It's not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" I came with a purpose. I came with a mission to call sinners. And this statement idea of mission, and we're going to see that there's actually three things that round that out in a very significant way, then summarized in the end of chapter 10. But what you see in these statements is that Jesus has come not to seek him and serve himself, but he has come on a mission, an intended and purposeful task. And so with that, then there's language in Mark's gospel that seems to attend to that. Some of that is temporal language, timing. If you come back to chapter 1, let me give you an illustration. Very, very time-oriented in Mark's gospel. And so when you get to verse 9 in chapter 1, he says, "In those days Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee, baptized by John in the Jordan." Doesn't say a whole lot about it, but then he says, "Immediately coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opening and the Spirit descending." Verse 12, "Immediately the Spirit impelled him to go out into the wilderness." Verse 18, "Immediately they left their nets." Verse 20, "Immediately he called them and they left their father Zebedee." Verse 21, "They went into Capernaum and immediately on the Sabbath." Verse 29, "And immediately after they came out of the synagogue." You see that repeated over and over and over again, straightway or immediately. And you see this kind of progression through Mark's gospel. And I think the way Mark is demonstrating and using this is to say, in a temporal fashion, what Jesus is doing is purposefully moving through time. He's on a mission. That he moves from one thing to the next, to the next. Very purposeful. And he expresses this in these temporal terms. That mission, I said, it's going to be elaborated on a little later. If you turn now to Mark, a little further on in Mark's Gospel, to Mark chapter 8. In Mark chapter 8, which becomes a turning point, like Matthew in some measure, to the Gospel, after Peter has responded and said, "You are the Christ," in verse 29, and he warned them not to tell anyone about him. Verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, be killed after 3 days, and rise again. That he starts to associate the fact that he must. It was necessary for him to suffer, to be killed. Over into chapter 9, you see that repeated again. Verse 30, from there he went out, began to go through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and when he's been killed, he'll rise 3 days later." And they still don't understand this. Into chapter 10, which is where we're going to camp for a few minutes. Verse 32, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. They were headed up there to Jerusalem for the purpose, to fulfill this purpose. And Jesus was walking on ahead of them, and they were amazed. And those who followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside, and he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man is going to be delivered to the chief priests, the scribes, and they'll condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They'll mock him, and spit on him, and scourge him, and kill him, and 3 days later he'll rise again." James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do something for us, whatever we ask of you." And he said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm going to be baptized?" And what he's referring to is the manner of his death, the suffering that he's going to endure. And they said, "We are able." And that was realized. James was martyred. John was exiled. "The cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, that's not mine to give. It's somebody else's. But it's for those for whom it has been prepared." Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John, obviously. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave, the bondservant of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting on the road. And when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many were sternly telling him to be quiet, and he kept crying out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." And so they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up, he's calling for you." And throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up, came to Jesus, and answering him, Jesus says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight, began following him on the road. It is verse 45 that then becomes this key statement of mission and purpose that seems to characterize the Gospel of Mark. "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Unlike temporal rulers, unlike Nero, who has only himself at the focus of his attention, he's there to serve him and have you serve him. Everything is about him. Unlike them, this King of heaven, this King, this Son of God, this Christ, this Son of Man, which is a messianic term we said comes from Daniel chapter 7 primarily, and it attests to who he is, that even him, that this one is not like a human king. This one is not in this role for what he gets out of it for himself. He comes to serve. And ultimately, that act of service is the giving of his life, his own life, as a ransom. This was so upside down for the world in which they lived, and I'm sure it's upside down for our world too. You remember Jesus had said it was rich people, very difficult for rich people, he said, to enter the kingdom of heaven. The disciples were amazed at that and said, "Well, geez, if rich people can't get in, then who can get in?" And Jesus responded to that and said, "Listen, it's different. It's not impossible, but it is possible with God, but there are things that are different. There are ones, those who have left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children, farms for my sake and for the gospel's sake, that he'll receive 100 times as much now. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Again, written to people who had lost their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, their brothers, who had lost their lands, their houses because of the persecution. These are people who are suffering. Everything is being stripped away from them so that they have nothing. And they're suffering. And in the midst of this, Mark's message to them is regarding their king who came to serve them and to suffer with them and for them. And so Jesus is presented as the king who serves his people unlike any other. Verse 45, for the Son of Man, that term from Daniel, he did not come to be served, but instead to serve, to be the waiter, to be the one who gives himself and ministers to others. Now what's interesting is that that's actually a little different word, but it still carries the same idea from the end of verse 44. When Jesus says, if you want to be great, you've got to be the least. Whoever wishes to be first has to be the slave of all. It's a different word that he uses there. There it's the word bondservant. I know when we use the word slave, our picture is of those, maybe from a historical context here in the U.S., but that's not the picture. The picture of a bondservant is one who is maybe being compelled, but one who then willingly puts themselves in a place of servitude to somebody else. Maybe because of indebtedness or circumstances. But they lose and surrender all their rights to serve somebody else. I understand a little bit of that. My grandmother was an indentured servant. She served at the pleasure of others. And Jesus says whoever wishes to be great has to voluntarily place themselves in servitude to be the servant of all. Because even the Son of Man didn't come to be served. And ultimately, the way he did that voluntarily, he says, was to give his life, to voluntarily surrender his own life as a ransom. The idea of a payment, it's a picture of a payment being made to release somebody from slavery, from that indentured servitude. And he did that for many. Now, I believe that when Mark is doing this, in this quotation or allusion in verse 45, goes back to Isaiah. Just as he began very early on the good news concerning Christ, and here it comes out of Isaiah, Mark draws from Isaiah to describe for us the good news of who Jesus is. And it ought to be very familiar. This passage that I think he's drawing upon is very familiar. It's the passage of the song of the suffering servant, the servant of the Lord. So keep something there and go back to Isaiah 52, and you'll see something of the language. Something of the language that's borne out in this very familiar song here in Isaiah that speaks of the servant of the Lord. It actually begins in chapter 52, verse 13. Behold, my servant will prosper. He'll be high and lifted up and greatly exalted, but he's going to suffer. Surely, verse 4, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. he took on something that wasn't his. You see, to give his life a ransom for, or in the stead of, on behalf of, in place of the many. He takes on that's not his, and that's what he describes here in verse 4. Verse 5, he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Verse 10, the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he had rendered himself as a guilt offering, he'll see his offspring, he'll prolong his days. The good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he'll see it, be satisfied, and by his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. The middle of verse 12. Because he poured out himself to death, was numbered with the transgressors, yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. He gave his life as a ransom for the many. The many is not just a numerical reference. It refers to here for the people of Israel, the elect people, and so we might also translate that even into the New Testament for the many, those for whom Christ died. And so when you go back to chapter 10, what he's saying is that Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Son of Man, is the suffering servant. He's the king who suffers with his people and for his people in order to serve his people, in order to set them free from the oppression and from the bondage of sin and of death. So they might experience freedom, and they might experience forgiveness of sin, and they might experience eternal life. And so he writes this to these people who are suffering. And you have to say, well, why would this be of such interest to them? What would be an encouragement to them? I believe it's this. That they have a mission. It's the beginning of the good news. The beginning of the good news. Now, they are on a mission, and they have a mission to declare that good news about who Christ is. And so it's an encouragement to them to persevere and to endure and to press on. To press on with regards to who Christ is. And how they express that, even in the midst of suffering. You know what strikes me in the context of this? I don't know if you caught this. We can look at James and John and say, well, what these guys, what were they all? But remember, this comes right out on the heels of 3 times, very quick. I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die. And they're on their way to Jerusalem for him to die. And they come to Jesus and they say, we want you to do something for us. And Jesus' response is this: what do you want me to do for you? Did you hear that? You know what? You see it again after this account in verse 45, where there's a blind man beside the road who's calling out to him, Son of David, Son of David. And what does Jesus say to him? What do you want me to do for you? Jesus is on his way to die the cruelest and most vile death, and what is first and foremost in the heart of his mind is, what do I do to serve you? Now, how does that translate for mission for those who are suffering? This is how it translates. On your way of being taken and dragged into the Colosseum, how do you turn to that Roman who has slandered you and accused you and spit on you and scourged you and treated you this way? How do you turn to that Roman soldier and say to him, by the way, what can I do for you? See, that's where those Beatitudes start to take real measure now. To bless those who persecute you. To love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. While anticipating the greatest of suffering, the heart of the servant still looks out for the good and the welfare of somebody else. Just like Jesus did. You persevere and you endure with the good news in the midst of suffering, because the best thing that you could do for them is to declare to them the good news of who Christ is. And certainly by following Christ's example. If Christ has suffered for you, what more do you need? That's why when you go to 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 Peter is all about suffering. 1 Peter chapter 2, who is given as a great illustration that we're to model? Christ himself. The suffering of Christ. And certainly there's a hope of perseverance and pressing on because of a sense of expectation. Of expectation that there's something more than what we see in this life. And you see that at the end of verse 31. The many who will be first will be last, and the last first. The sincere and genuine belief that suffering, temporary in this world, ushers in something that is greater. And I believe this, that ministry of Jesus, of being one who serves his people, didn't end with his suffering and his death. It didn't end with his exaltation. I think it continues. I think Jesus is still there asking his people, what can I do for you? He's there to continually minister to his people. So that the writer of the Hebrews says we don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is tested in all ways, even as we are, yet without sin. Let us come boldly, therefore, to the throne of grace to receive mercy, to receive grace to help in our time of need. Jesus still responds, even though he is the exalted king and all authority has been granted to him. He is still not sitting on the throne saying, okay, now you all serve me. He still desires, as a righteous and faithful shepherd and king, to meet the needs of his people. And so when you pray, when you come to the throne of grace, there are times you're going to ask for things that aren't so wise, like James and John. But that's where the wisdom of God says, look, do you really know what you're asking for? By the way, Jesus says, I still submit myself to the authority of the one who has the power to grant, and always by the will of the Father. See? But in the perfect wisdom and the perfect goodness of God, he answers the prayer and says, what do you want me to do? I will extend to you mercy, and I'll extend to you grace to help in time of need. He continues that. And so those who are going through the greatest sufferings of life, the word of encouragement to them that Mark is driving home is that you have a king who continues to serve you because he loves you. I couldn't help but think, Amos and Sina, Ryan, what a great text for women who have been sold into slavery, who are indentured servants, who are abused and suffer, to know that there's a king, unlike other men who treat them only for their own benefit. There is a king who came and gave them his own life in order to set them free. He paid a ransom to set them free. What greater message do those women have? He's not like their clients. And he's there to help them. He continues. I believe that's what Mark's gospel is all about. It's about Jesus as our king, but one who serves his people. If you're here this morning, you may be a believer. Let me just say, look, you're not alone. He hasn't gotten to the point where, now he's above you. So he doesn't talk to you. Jesus is still there. What can I do for you? If he's given his own life for you to set you free, what makes you think he'll turn his back on you now? And if you've never trusted Christ, you're really no different than Nero, trying to do things on your own agenda, in your own way, and on your own terms. And you don't realize that you really are a slave, just as Nero didn't realize that he truly was a slave to his own appetites and passions. Christ came to stand in your place, to set you free from that you can experience the forgiveness of sins and the gift of life everlasting that begins not when you die, it begins now. That's what Christ came to do. That was his mission. Our mission continues to declare that message. It was the beginning of the gospel, and we continue to declare that faithfully, despite what may come our way in days ahead.